And maybe you heard this, but comic book-based movies are kind of a thing now. And by thing, I mean they're like the whole thing now. And they're a big deal. And our next guest, who I always love talking to, has written about the one that was maybe supposed to have more of a social impact than it actually has had so far, but she will give us our thoughts on that. Lyta Gold is the amusements editor and the managing editor of Current Affairs magazine, and she wrote a piece about the movie Joker, but it is a piece about much more than that. It is entitled The Stories We Tell, Why Narratives Matter and Don't, and Matter and Don't, ... So, Lyta Gold, first of all, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks. It's so good to be back.
It's great to have you. And let's talk about, let's start with this. So with all the cultural chazarai, as we cultural historians say, around this movie, I thought actually the other day when it was raining, I'd just go to the local multiplex and see it. But I didn't because I thought, well, it's raining, it's kind of gloomy. It's probably a bummer. And B, I'm not sure if there's as much there to mine intellectually as I might have expected. But what did you think? Was it a bummer, and was there a lot to mine there intellectually?
Was it a bummer? I would say yes. There's some actual real pathos in it. Joaquin Phoenix is a very good actor, and he mines all the really sad parts. It's a story about a guy with pretty severe mental illness who is struggling in a city that has terrible social services. And I happen to have a lot of friends who are social workers because I used to work at a social services agency. And that part all rang very true and is very compelling and sad. Much of the rest of the movie, though, is just sort of imitation Scorsese. And you kind of have to like that kind of thing. I'm really bored with that kind of thing, so it doesn't do much for me. And one director like imitating another's aesthetic and doing all of these like, oh, do you recognize this shot from this thing? I'm like, I don't care. I'm not in a film studies class right now. I'm in a theater.
Right. It's kind of like runaway Quentin Tarantinoism, isn't it?
Yes.
But what I love about your piece on it is that you kind of circle the Joker movie itself like a predator stalks its prey, but in a good way. Because you really frame it in the narrative or in the context of larger narratives. So you start with, the nerd boys who would become attached to you based on shared interests, fantasy novels and all that sci-fi. And then you would become like capital T, capital G, the girl. And basically, as I would reinterpret it, the narrative kicks in, right? It's no longer like two people sharing interests. It's a sort of pre-programmed script kicking in where you're A, B, and C in his mind, and then a story is being unspooled, like on a film reel, and you're not two human beings anymore, and you sort of place the film in that context. Am I putting that correctly?
Yeah, and it's always good to start an essay with extremely embarrassing personal anecdotes.
I do it all the time. Yeah.
Because this was a real problem, especially when I was younger. Not so much now. Now that I'm married, men don't look at me. But back in the day, it was an issue that all these boys would suddenly be very interested in me just really because I happened to be there. And a big fear about this Joker movie was that it was going to be, it was the incel movie. And that had a lot to do with how it was branded and the marketing campaign around it and the things that the director said. And really the way the trailer was cut. The trailer was cut in a really funny way that's very different from the actual movie itself. Because the severe mental illness part isn't really, it's extremely significant in the movie and it's barely there in the trailer. And it just seems like this lonely guy who nobody respects and can't get the girl. And they very much played on this marketing, I think, deliberately. It's a sort of draw out this controversy, and of course people freaked out. People were like, oh, this is going to trigger mass incel killings, and of course nothing happened. But there is this problem all the same where this kind of story gets told where the guy deserves the girl, and it often is a troubled young white man who deserves the girl. And when you're told the story again and again and again, it gets into your head. And it was really like tragic and funny when I was an adolescent that kept happening. And I was just like, I just met you, why is this why are we going through this story? I think I don't think there's even any romantic thing here. I think we're just friends. But it kept happening and kept happening.
So what you're really saying, Lyta, is that, and why I think it's so, relevant to the story of this movie is, and I hadn't really thought about it before, but these sort of romantic, lonely nerd boys,
Hmm.
or would-be romantic, we think of the depersonalization of women, or I've been raised to think of the objectification of women in like physical terms, which is a real and horrible thing. But this is almost in a kind of a mythic depersonalization of women. In other words, which is equally as corrosive and evil, which, if taken, if taken to its extreme, which is that the woman becomes like not a person, but a kind of holy grail object, not a holy grail slash holy girl, if you will, that's being pursued and therefore is not real, and therefore it's just a hero's quest, and anything that stands in the way of achieving the hero's quest, including the person themselves and their wishes, becomes an obstacle to be overcome. And you're almost, even if the movie isn't themed that way, the advertising itself strikes me as very irresponsible, because it's setting up and reinforcing this programming that says women are objects to be won and nothing should stand in the hero's way, including the woman.
Hmm. And you see this reinforced in a lot of places. And Jordan Peterson is making a career out of reinforcing that exact set of imagery. The
Right.
women are these chaotic beings too that need to be conquered because it's dangerous that they're the way they are. And yeah, and again, it's funny because the movie itself doesn't really support this reading. It seems to have been a conscious decision to market it that way to get controversy. And it worked very well. They made a ton of money on this movie. And DC has been struggling,
Right.
and they did extremely well.
So obviously something worked. I'm a little surprised that a downbeat supervillain movie
Hmm.
has done such great box office. But obviously, you can market a movie for a great opening weekend, right? But you can't
Hmm.
market a movie for multiple strong weekends. And it's, going toe to toe. Interestingly enough, in the box office with the new Maleficent movie, which is
Hmm.
the Wicked Witch movie. So here you have the movie marketed as the incel movie, going toe to toe, and
Hmm.
I think edging out the powerful, woman figure. But those are the two dominant movies right now. Are we living in the sort of cinematic battle of the super sexes? What's going on? What world are we living in?
Well, and I think, and one thing I tried to get into the piece a little bit is that the material conditions underpinning this have a lot to do with it. One of the things that's really, really peculiar about the time we're living in is people tend to look at this and they say, oh, people really like superhero movies and people really like these old Disney classics sort of retold. I'm not convinced that they do. I think it's just these are the movies that we're given. And there's a tremendous amount of money and marketing machine behind it and a lot of really charismatic actors that really sell this. One of the reasons that Marvel movies have been as successful as they have been is they are really, really well cast. The actors are really charming, they're really attractive, they're very popular, and they're really good at marketing it. And that is a huge part of what has been selling these movies.
Well, I got to tell you, I got to make a confession here. As I've been a failed social critic in this regard, which is I liked the first Avengers movie. I liked the first Captain America movie. I liked the first two, maybe 2.2 Iron Man movies. But these movies, the CGI is unwatchable to me. It looks like crap. And I had to stop. I tried Infinity War. I just can't get through it. So I'm like off the beat, but I'm gonna take, people will take the human stories they're given. I think is part of your point. And Martin Scorsese has been trashing, I guess, the Marvel universe, and Francis Coppola, who by the way I worked for a long time ago. Francis
Really?
Coppola, yeah, he doubled down on it. But I guess people need stories, right? And if they're given Marvel stories, and that's 90% of what, ticket sales are, or 70% or whatever, I mean, does it even matter?
Yeah, I mean, it's especially when something is big and talked about, and that's what Joker managed to do was get this, this all of this discussion around it, and then people have FOMO and then they want to go see it. I think there's also I'm very squirrely about this conversation that the famous, these extremely famous, extremely rich directors,
Right.
like Martin Scorsese is a multimillionaire. He's like $100 million. He's fine.
Yeah.
Like he's not as rich as Disney, but like Disney's a corporation. Um, I'm a little squirrely about this conversation because it gets really tricky, and I know this in part because I've studied a lot of like the history of the reception of sci-fi and fantasy literature over the years, and the way that popular media has been the sort of artificial barriers between like pop culture and like high culture they have a lot to do with class, and
Right.
it's funny because that's sort of not relevant anymore because you can be an extremely wealthy person and like be way into Marvel and like buy movie props and stuff for millions of dollars. So it's not exactly the same kind of class barrier that it used to, but it still has these old vestiges where people are kind of trying to draw a distinction between themselves as the classy people who like the good things and the good art, and then the trashy people who like the bad art. And very, very often, stories that have sci-fi elements or fantasy elements are fall into like the bucket of the trashiness, where like bourgeois realism for a very long time, or like violent crime things, like like Scorsese, like these stories about men who do violent things and they
Right.
can't help it because that's what men are. That has been this kind of story that gets taken seriously, and and then like again, like chick flicks aren't serious, and and there are formulas in all of these. There's good and bad art in all of these, but I think this is a trickier conversation than people realize. Again, because the participants are all very, very wealthy, and because setting up these barriers and saying that telling people that they're stupid for liking something has these weird classist overtones, which again aren't really part of why I don't like it is because it's not really relevant to the way class is structured anymore. So I don't understand why people are doing it. I don't know what they're getting out of it.
Well,
People like the
that
stuff they like.
yeah, it's a fascinating conversation, but and I'm sure it has many resonances to it. One of the things that occurs to me is our whole notion of what it means in that cultural conversation. Because high art. There was a time when Taxi Driver wouldn't, by Scorsese, wouldn't have been considered high art, but Children of Paradise by Renoir would be, Marcel Carnet
Yeah,
would
yeah.
be, I mean, so it evolves over time, right? But we got to a point and have been there for multiple decades now. It's interesting to me when you think about it, where realism is gritty movies about like mafia guys rubbing somebody
Right.
out, right?
Which is
But
not
where
realistic at all.
Whereas Beaches, for example, or some sentimental movie about broken relationships is not, it's a chick flick, it's not realistic. But wait a minute, let's stop for a second. The lived experience of most people includes heartbreak and death. The lived experience of very few people includes rubbing somebody out in a mafia hit. So you could make the case that our very definition of gritty and realistic is a fetishization of an experience that, to the extent it occurs at all, is a very obscure and strange and almost irrelevant, or probably irrelevant one, except to the extent that we as a culture choose to exalt and make important and describe as realistic acts of brutality and savagery between two males.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because these are stories about men. They're often women in the story, but they're backgrounded,
Right.
and they're supporting. They're the upset wife or they're the bitch girlfriend, something like that. And what these stories do, and much in the way that like a hero kind of incel story does, is they tell men that this is what men are like, and this is what seriousness looks like, and this is what complexity looks like. It's interesting. Obama said the other day that he was talking about purity and and like wokeness, and he's like, well, sometimes you have to do things that are upsetting or difficult, or things that are impure, and that is actually kind of the same thing. He's making a complexity argument, like a complex man is one who has to order the death of a 16-year-old boy, I suppose.
Right.
And that's not complex at all unless you say it is, unless all of our decisions about what makes humans and especially men complex is that they do violence, that they have to make the hard choices and do these terrible things. And that's not everyday. It's not even everyday experience. It's not even metaphorical experience, because like superhero stuff isn't real experience, but it can be in a way metaphorical for how you feel in society. You feel like an outsider, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, when I was a little kid, it was the dawn of the superhero era. And I collected comics, which my mom gave away, or they'd be worth like real money now. Believe me, Jeff Weaver, Bernie's campaign manager, ran a comic book store, and he told me, and it broke my heart. But
Oh no.
yeah, but they really Spider-Man when it came out. It really captured for me and for a lot of kids, and maybe it was already out, but in the early days, a kind of pathos of adolescence that was real. And even Fantastic Four. I had the first Fantastic Four comic, by the way.
Oh, really?
In the old, yeah. Reed Richards was the brainy guy, and I kind of felt like I was probably a brainy guy too. So, identified with Reed, and I mean, whatever it is, I am like you. I mean, I think that culture speaks to people when and where they are. And, Gothic literature was considered low art, and now people study it. And, but I guess and to conclude on the whole Joker thing, the most interesting thing to me about it is it almost was on the verge of a moral panic like we used to see or read about. I don't go back to the 50s consciously anyway, but Blackboard Jungle or The Wild One or this, they would create these moral panics that people would riot at the theaters, or a rock and roll record would come out and it's going to start a gang war or whatever, because Elvis Presley sang Hound Dog or whatever. And I guess we had a kind of echo about that around Joker, didn't we? These warnings that there's going to be incel violence, and it just didn't happen. Is it because it's just not that interesting or good, or is it just like they just misread the culture, or what?
Well, it's interesting because on the one hand, it was primarily a liberal panic. It was primarily liberals who were getting very upset about this. But the warnings were actually coming from the military and the NYPD and all of that. And so that's a little strange. And I wonder if maybe there was some online chatter that got picked up, and then it just, for whatever, maybe it was just trolling and it fizzled. Because, like the NYPD, et cetera, is not known for being liberal. But so there's an argument that gets made a lot by liberals, and I think people on the left find it very frustrating. I know I do. And the argument is that if we can just sort of fix the culture, if we can just sort of fix these narratives, then everything is going to be okay. There's no material analysis whatsoever. There was a recent article by Lindy West in the New York Times, and she was talking about like the impact of Clueless, et cetera. And it wasn't, I don't think it was quite as bad as people thought it was, but the headline was something like, "Clueless is why we have Donald Trump." And
for God's sake.
I know, it was ridiculous.
I love that movie, by the way. Just parenthetically, I thought it was a great movie.
It's a great movie.
Yeah.
And it's just and she obviously didn't pick the title. I really don't think so. But you see these kinds of arguments, and they're really, really frustrating arguments because that isn't true. Like, narratives affect us a lot, but the idea that narratives, like, completely irrespective of material conditions, are the only things that affect how we think and feel is absurd. And so this idea that that art has to be moral, that it's not okay to make an incel movie. If the movie had been more of an incel movie, and like what the marketing had actually promised, I think that would have been fine. The problem that I have is that all the movies are like this movie. So many movies celebrate male violence. So many superhero movies celebrate male violence, and that might seem like, well, isn't what they are? But that isn't necessarily what they have to be. And like an interesting, if superhero movies are not going to go away because of corporate dominance, like an interesting direction to go into would be, how do they solve their problems without punching people? That would be a cool story to tell.
Yeah, but there's some effort involved in coming up with that story. And unfortunately, there's a million other things I'd love to talk to you about regarding this, but we're going to have to wrap it there. So, Lyta, the article, and I think you probably did pick your own headline, even if Lindy West did not. Yeah, I suspect the stories we tell, why narratives matter and don't. Lyta Gold, managing editor and amusements editor of Current Affairs. Thanks for writing it, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks. This was great fun as always.